Case 1. On May 20, 2022 in Orono, Minnesota, 28-year-old Julissa Thaler was stopped by police after officers observed a sedan with a shattered rear window and a flat tire. The driver appeared disoriented while surrounded by debris, tools, and personal items scattered throughout the interior. During the interaction, officers noted signs that suggested additional concerns beyond a routine traffic stop. The vehicle was impounded for further examination. Later that day, authorities discovered the body of Thaler's 6-year-old son, Eli Hart, in the trunk. Investigators immediately redirected attention toward Thaler as a primary subject of interest. The traffic stop was logged in the early morning hours. Responding officers documented the broken rear window, visible damage to the vehicle, and a strong odor from inside the cabin. Thaler dismissed assistance and attempted to leave the scene, but police impounded the car due to safety concerns. Investigators began inventory procedures at a tow facility. Blankets, clothing, and trash were removed, revealing biological evidence consistent with recent trauma. Officers opened the trunk and located the body of a young child later confirmed as Eli Hart. The discovery transformed a simple vehicle stop into a homicide investigation. Forensic personnel were called to process the vehicle, and child welfare authorities were notified. No immediate explanation was provided by Thaler, but early evidence contradicted the notion of an accidental event. Eli Hart was 6 years old, enrolled in elementary school, and involved in routine community activities. He lived between two households due to an ongoing custody arrangement involving his mother and father. Court records showed active motions regarding custody and welfare, highlighting documented concerns raised by Eli's father about Thaler's stability and suitability as a caregiver. Social services had been contacted multiple times regarding the family. Reports described erratic behavior, mental health concerns, and law enforcement interactions involving Thaler. Despite these documented issues, Eli spent scheduled time with his mother as part of the custody plan. The family system involved multiple agencies, including child protection workers and court officials. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives secured the vehicle and requested forensic processing. Ballistic evidence was recovered from the trunk area and passenger compartment. Spent casings were collected and documented. Autopsy results confirmed multiple gunshot wounds. Digital records were obtained through warrants for phone data, location history, and communication logs. Medical and social services documentation was reviewed to establish a timeline of custody disputes and prior warnings. Investigators mapped Thaler's movements through surveillance footage, fuel purchases, and witness statements from locations visited earlier that morning. Firearm records were requested from retail systems. Custody files identified the extent of prior institutional involvement, revealing procedural decisions that preceded the homicide. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Ammunition purchased data from retail sources confirmed that Thaler had acquired rounds compatible with the recovered ballistic evidence. Store surveillance documented the transaction days before the homicide. Investigators located the firearm disposal site through trace evidence and municipal waste collection logs. Surveillance footage from parking lots and traffic cameras placed Thaler's vehicle in locations consistent with the reconstructed homicide timeline. Forensic reporting linked ammunition, casings, and projectile fragments. Based on these findings, authorities issued an arrest warrant. Thaler was detained, transported to a county facility, and charged with multiple counts including first-degree murder. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Thaler was tried in Minnesota District Court. Prosecutors presented forensic reports, ballistic analysis, surveillance footage, communications data, and testimony from social workers and family members. The defense introduced mental health records and argued diminished responsibility, but the court found the evidence of planning and execution consistent with intentional homicide. Thaler was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Courtroom footage circulated widely due to Thaler's conduct during sentencing. Public and media commentary focused on the documented custody warnings preceding Eli's death. State officials and advocacy groups referenced the case in discussions on child welfare reforms. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 2. On February 19, 2008 in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, 9-year-old Shannon Matthews was reported missing after failing to return home from school. The disappearance generated immediate concern due to her age and the short distance between school and her residence. Early statements from her mother, Cottrez Matthews, presented a narrative consistent with a stranger abduction. However, as police documented inconsistencies in timelines and demeanor, attention began shifting toward the family environment and Cotrez's role. The case transitioned from a routine missing child alert to a complex investigation involving behavioral scrutiny. The initial report triggered one of the largest missing child operations in contemporary UK policing. Officers coordinated door-to-door inquiries, organized foot searches, and requested public assistance. Hundreds of volunteers canvassed parks, alleys, and abandoned buildings. Sniffer dogs and helicopter units were deployed, and waterways were examined. Schools, transportation hubs, and local businesses were contacted for sightings. National media outlets carried the story, amplifying community involvement. Alerts were broadcast through print and television, while local authorities assembled temporary command centers. The scale of mobilization reflected both the urgency of the situation and the hope that Shannon remained within the local area. As time passed without credible sightings, investigators noted the absence of physical evidence consistent with a forced abduction, prompting deeper analysis. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Shannon's daily life revolved around a short walk between her home and school. She lived in a multi-child household within a working-class estate characterized by limited financial resources. The family environment involved complex social relationships, including extended relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances who were frequently present. Cotrez's domestic partner had relatives living nearby, including properties within walking distance. Shannon had no documented behavioral issues, and teachers described consistent attendance. The socioeconomic context of the family was marked by financial constraints, reliance on welfare support, and limited oversight from external agencies. Proximity between households created opportunities for interaction among adults connected to Cottrez. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Investigators began examining behavioral cues from Cottrez during press conferences and police interactions. Officers noted repetitive statements, unusual emotional presentation, and shifting details in her recounting of events. The growing reward fund for Shannon's safe return added a financial dimension to the case. As tips accumulated, police noticed a pattern of dead-end leads traceable to individuals connected to Cotrez's social circle. Surveillance and interviews gradually narrowed the search area to addresses associated with Michael Donovan, a relative by partnership. After 3 weeks, a covert entry into Donovan's flat revealed Shannon alive, hidden in a bed compartment. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. After Shannon was recovered, Donovan provided information indicating a staged abduction plan with Cottrez. Investigators reconstructed communications, movements, and financial incentives linked to the reward fund. Timeline analysis confirmed coordination between both adults before and during the disappearance. Forensic examination of the flat documented restraints and sedatives consistent with prolonged concealment rather than impulsive confinement. Interviews with neighbors and family members established Cottrez's involvement through corroborated statements. The conspiracy centered on splitting reward money following a staged discovery. Both suspects were charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and perverting the course of justice. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were tried in 2009. Prosecutors presented a financial motive supported by reward activity, recorded communications, and forensic evidence from the property. The defense argued coercion and diminished responsibility, but presented no alternative explanation consistent with the evidence. Both defendants received 8-year custodial sentences. Public response was marked by outrage due to the exploitation of community resources and emotional investment. Shannon was placed under protective measures, granted a new identity, and relocated to prevent future exploitation. Media and academic commentary referenced the case in discussions about class, welfare systems, and child protection frameworks. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 3. In January 2011 in Tampa, Florida, officers responding to a welfare concern located 50-year-old Julie Schenecker injured inside her residence. In separate rooms of the home, her two teenage children, 16-year-old Beau and 13-year-old Kelsey, were found deceased from gunshot wounds. Julie's injuries were consistent with a failed suicide attempt. The scene presented no evidence of forced entry or third-party involvement. Early assessments by investigators immediately shifted focus toward Julie's deteriorating mental health and recent psychiatric instability as potential factors. The welfare check was requested after extended family members and military contacts were unable to reach anyone in the home. Officers entered the property and conducted a protective sweep, locating Julie in a semi-conscious state and discovering the bodies of the children upstairs and in a vehicle in the garage. Emergency medical personnel transported Julie for treatment, while detectives secured the residence. Crime scene technicians documented firearm evidence, spent casings, blood patterns, and positional details indicating the shootings occurred hours before discovery. A handgun was recovered with ammunition consistent with the wounds. After initial processing, the residence was designated a homicide scene, and the investigation formally escalated. The Schenecker household consisted of Julie, a stay-at-home mother, her husband, Colonel Parker Schenecker, an active-duty U.S. Army officer frequently deployed, and their two children, both involved in school activities. Records and testimony later confirmed that Julie had a documented history of depression and bipolar disorder, and had undergone inpatient psychiatric treatment. Recent medical adjustments included antidepressant and mood-stabilizing medications. Extended family and acquaintances described periods of withdrawal and conflict within the household, particularly related to adolescent discipline. The combination of military family stressors, mental health challenges, and limited supervision during deployments formed the broader context. Detectives obtained Julie's medical records, reviewed prescription histories, and interviewed treating psychiatrists. Documentation confirmed recent changes in medication dosage and reported depressive episodes. Investigators recovered a receipt showing Julie had purchased a .38 caliber revolver days before the shootings. Her post-incident statements to officers and medical staff described a deliberate decision to kill the children while they were at home. Time-of-death estimates were corroborated by ballistic trajectories, blood pattern analysis, and digital device logs. The investigative timeline established that Beau was shot first in the vehicle after school, and Kelsey was shot later inside the home, followed by Julie's attempted suicide. The evidence aligned with intentional acts rather than spontaneous violence. Once stabilized, Julie was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Competency evaluations were ordered to determine her ability to stand trial. Forensic psychiatrists concluded she understood the nature of the charges and the legal process. The prosecution rejected an insanity defense, citing planning behavior, firearm acquisition, and coherent post-incident statements. The defense presented extensive mental health evidence, but did not dispute that Julie committed the shootings. The court found sufficient grounds to proceed, and a jury evaluated both the factual and psychiatric components. These determinations formed the basis for the legal breakthrough in the case. Julie Schenecker was convicted on both counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Public reaction reflected divided opinions. Some viewed the case primarily through the lens of mental illness and system failures, while others emphasized premeditation and responsibility. Colonel Schenecker later became active in public discussions on grief, resilience, and the impact of family mental health issues, establishing support initiatives in his children's names. Julie remains incarcerated in the Florida state prison system, periodically filing mental health-related appeals and requests for review. To this day, debate continues regarding the weight of psychiatric illness in the legal outcome. Case 4. Between 2014 and 2015 in Bellefontaine, Ohio, multiple unexplained child deaths occurred within the same household. The first incident was attributed to sudden infant death and drew limited suspicion. Months later, a second child died unexpectedly, prompting renewed concern. When a third young son died in similar circumstances, medical staff and law enforcement recognized a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Scrutiny shifted toward the mother, Brittany Pilkington, as the only consistent adult present during each death. The trigger for the homicide review began with the death of Brittany's infant son, Niall, in July 2014. Medical personnel noted no signs of assault, and the cause was recorded as sudden infant death syndrome. In April 2015, 4-year-old Gavin was found unresponsive in bed, again with no immediate signs of injury. The second death raised internal concerns among first responders, pediatricians, and social workers. In August 2015, 3-month-old Noah died under similar circumstances. 3 deaths within 13 months pushed the case out of medical anomaly territory. Emergency personnel reported inconsistencies in Brittany's demeanor, and the absence of environmental risk factors prompted a shift from medical to criminal inquiry. As investigators compared timelines, locations, and witness availability, the theory of natural causes collapsed. The family structure consisted of Brittany, her husband Joseph, their children, and extended relatives periodically involved in caregiving. The household had documented marital strain and a history involving previous relationships, creating a complex relational environment. Statements and later psychiatric assessments described a jealousy motive rooted in Brittany's perception that Joseph favored the boys over their surviving daughter. Historical records revealed Brittany's own experiences with abuse, contributing to emotional instability. Cognitive testing during the case identified intellectual limitations that affected her reasoning and coping abilities. These dynamics formed the context in which the crimes occurred. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Investigators identified a pattern absent in typical sudden infant deaths. Forensic pathologists evaluated pulmonary congestion, petechial hemorrhaging, and oxygen deprivation indicators consistent with smothering rather than natural causes. Interviews with Brittany produced contradictory statements about sleep arrangements and discovery circumstances. During forensic questioning, she described placing blankets over the children's faces and holding them there until they ceased moving. Her confession aligned with physical findings, establishing suffocation as the cause. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered to assess competence, decision-making capacity, and potential mental illness. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Prosecutors charged Brittany with multiple counts of aggravated murder. Initial filings contemplated the death penalty due to the aggravating factor of multiple victims. Defense counsel negotiated on the basis of diminished capacity and significant mental health concerns. Ultimately, prosecutors removed the death penalty in exchange for guilty pleas on 3 counts. The plea eliminated the need for trial testimony from medical experts and family members and ensured a permanent custodial outcome. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Brittany Pilkington was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Child Protective Services intervened to remove the surviving daughter from the environment, placing her with alternative caretakers under confidentiality protections. Public reaction reflected anger, confusion, and debate surrounding the role of mental illness and cognitive impairment in sentencing. Advocacy groups cited the case as evidence of systemic gaps in monitoring high-risk families after repeated infant deaths. Pilkington remains incarcerated in the Ohio prison system, periodically referenced in discussions about neonaticide, forensic pathology, and maternal mental health. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 5. On November 29, 2014, in Santa Croce Camarina, Sicily, 8-year-old Laura Stivell was reported missing after failing to arrive at school. His mother, Veronica Panarello, stated she had dropped him off that morning, but early inquiries produced inconsistencies regarding timelines and locations. As investigators cross-checked her statements against physical and digital evidence, attention shifted away from the possibility of an abduction and toward internal family dynamics. The disappearance quickly escalated into a homicide investigation focused on the mother. The triggering event occurred when school personnel confirmed Loris was absent, despite Veronica's claim that she had left him at the entrance. A large-scale search began, involving local residents, law enforcement, and municipal emergency services. Officers examined roads, fields, ditches, and rural paths between the family home and the school. Helicopters and canine units were deployed to expand the search radius. Later that day, Loris's body was discovered in a ravine outside town. His school bag and belongings were scattered nearby, suggesting an intentional disposal rather than an accidental fall. The discovery transformed the case from a missing person scenario to a homicide investigation centered on the child's final movements. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Loris lived with his parents and a younger sibling in a small residential area where community members routinely crossed paths. His school schedule involved a short drive in the mornings, and no known behavioral or medical issues affected his routine. The surrounding town was geographically compact, with limited travel routes and high daily visibility among residents. Within the family structure, Veronica occupied the primary caregiving role, while extended relatives lived nearby. Investigators later documented relational instability, including Veronica's reported frustrations and strained interactions within the household. These factors created a context in which the child's autonomy was limited and parental access was continuous. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives examined municipal surveillance cameras along likely travel routes. Footage failed to show Veronica's car approaching the school at the claimed time, contradicting her account. Additional inconsistencies emerged in her shifting statements regarding timing and routing. Forensic evidence from the autopsy identified strangulation using plastic cable ties, eliminating theories involving accidents or unknown attackers. During interviews, Veronica attempted to shift suspicion to her father-in-law, alleging he had encountered Loris and later harmed him. Investigators tested this claim through alibi checks, phone data, and witness interviews, and determined there was no support for her accusation. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Surveillance reconstruction confirmed that Veronica never drove to the school. Cellular data and vehicle tracking placed her near the ravine at relevant times. Forensic analysis linked plastic ties from the home to markings on the child's neck. With the elimination of any third-party suspect and the falsification of Veronica's account, prosecutors secured charges for homicide and concealment of a body. Her attempt to implicate her father-in-law failed under evidentiary scrutiny, removing the final alternative narrative. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. In 2016, an Italian court convicted Veronica Panarello of murder and body concealment and issued a 30-year sentence, the maximum available short of life imprisonment under Italian law. She continued to deny responsibility, filing multiple appeals that were rejected. Public and media responses criticized her persistent accusations against uninvolved relatives and her refusal to acknowledge the forensic record. Loris's father secured custody of the surviving younger child. Legal scholars and commentators reference the case in discussions involving maternal filicide, false accusations, and digital evidence in homicide investigations. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 6. Between January and February 2018 in Warwickshire, England, two young sisters died under sudden and unexplained circumstances. The first death was initially documented as unexpected but not immediately classified as suspicious. 18 days later, a second child death occurred in the same household. Medical staff and police began to focus on the only consistent caregiver, their mother, 23-year-old Louise Porton. The proximity of the deaths and the absence of identifiable natural causes redirected investigative attention toward Louise's behavior and household environment. The trigger sequence began with an emergency call reporting that 3-year-old Lexi was struggling to breathe. Paramedics transported her to the hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. Louise displayed limited emotional engagement during medical questioning, prompting notes on demeanor in clinical records. 17 days later, Louise contacted emergency services again, now reporting that her 17-month-old daughter Scarlett had stopped breathing in a vehicle. Despite resuscitation attempts, Scarlett was also declared dead. The repetition of sudden respiratory collapse in siblings raised immediate suspicion among pediatric specialists. Hospital staff alerted law enforcement, who opened a review of medical histories, living conditions, and maternal conduct. As findings began to accumulate, the case transitioned from unexplained fatalities to potential homicide, but the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Lexi and Scarlett were young children entirely dependent on adult supervision for care and safety. The family structure consisted solely of Louise and her daughters, with no other consistent adult present in the home. Investigators later documented patterns of neglect driven by Louise's prioritization of social activities, dating interactions, and personal freedom over childcare. Witness statements described long periods during which the girls were left unattended in locked rooms. Environmental conditions in the home reflected inconsistent caregiving and limited routine structure. The vulnerability of the children, combined with their age and dependency, created conditions in which health concerns could be concealed or ignored without external detection. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Detectives obtained digital records from Louise's devices. Search histories captured queries involving suffocation, drowning, and lethality of certain respiratory obstructions. Messaging logs confirmed that Louise was active on multiple dating applications and engaged in sexually explicit exchanges within hours of Lexi's hospitalization. Communication timestamps showed no interruption for grief or crisis. Forensic pathology on both children reported congestion, petechial hemorrhaging, and airway obstruction markers consistent with deliberate suffocation. Cell tower data, travel times, and emergency call logs enabled reconstruction of the timeline surrounding Scarlett's death in the vehicle. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Forensic evidence indicated both children were intentionally smothered. Behavioral analysis and digital records established a motive centered on removing perceived obstacles to Louise's social and sexual activities. Prosecutors framed the case as premeditated homicide rather than impulsive violence, citing research history, messaging patterns, and absence of maternal attachment indicators. With forensic pathology confirming non-accidental asphyxiation in both deaths, Louise was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Louise Porton was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. Media coverage labeled her as prioritizing dating and nightlife over childcare, framing the case as driven by self-interest rather than mental illness. Public commentary emphasized the calculated nature of the acts, particularly the short interval between deaths and the digital evidence of planning. Louise filed appeals asserting misinterpretation of medical evidence and investigative bias, but none were successful. She remains incarcerated within the UK prison system under restricted status. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 7. In May 2007, in Kurim, Czech Republic, footage intercepted by a neighbor's baby monitor revealed a naked boy restrained in a small room. The unexpected broadcast prompted immediate alarm due to the apparent severity of the child's condition. The image of bruising, confinement, and visible distress rapidly drew attention toward the household of 31-year-old Clara Maurava. Police opened an emergency investigation, and the presence of multiple minors in the home intensified concerns about broader abuse. The discovery marked the beginning of a case involving cult influence, coercive control, and concealed identities. The triggering event occurred when a neighbor attempting to set up a baby monitor unexpectedly received a video feed showing a child confined and begging for help. The neighbor reported the footage to authorities, who initiated a forced entry into the Maurava residence. Inside, law enforcement located Clara's sons, Andrej and Jacob, both bearing signs of prolonged physical abuse. They were malnourished and exhibited bruises, burns, and scars consistent with repeated assaults. Investigators documented makeshift cages, restraints, and locked rooms used to confine the boys. The evidence contradicted any suggestion of accidental harm or single-incident violence. The home was secured as a crime scene. Medical teams removed the children for examination, and authorities prepared for an expansive investigation. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Andrej and Jacob lived with their mother Clara, who had been raising them within an insular environment shaped by religious sect influence and psychological manipulation. Clara was not acting alone. Her sister and a woman named Barbara, an adult impersonating a teenage girl, played central roles in the household. Barbara posed as a vulnerable minor, embedding herself into the family structure and gaining leverage over Clara through emotional and ideological pressure. Sect members promoted obedience, punishment, and ritualistic practices framed as spiritual discipline. The boys' isolation, combined with cult influence and adult impersonation, created conditions of total control. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Investigators expanded the inquiry beyond the immediate household. Medical examinations documented burns, cuts, forced starvation, and evidence of restraint consistent with long-term torture. Psychologists determined that Clara was subjected to coercive control by sect leadership, reducing resistance and facilitating compliance with abusive directives. Forensic teams analyzed communication records, letters, and digital media referencing a sect known as the Grail movement. Testimony and phone data linked additional adults to the ideology and to prior interactions with the children. The combination of injury documentation and cult network mapping established that the abuse was systemic, rather hand spontaneous. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Authorities identified multiple individuals connected to the sect, including Clara's sister and Barbara. After the raids, Barbara fled the country and was located months later in Norway, living under a new identity and again impersonating a minor. Her capture confirmed that impersonation and manipulation were deliberate strategies rather than misunderstandings. Prosecutors charged several sect members with abuse-related offenses. Cooperation from some defendants led to further evidence of planning, psychological domination, and collective participation. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Trials were held in 2008, resulting in sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years for those involved, including Clara. Media coverage criticized the penalties as disproportionately lenient given the severity of the abuse. Public outrage grew, especially after revelations about the sect's international dimensions and Barbara's escape and recapture. International outlets reported extensively on the case, highlighting failures in child protection and the difficulty of detecting abuse concealed within cult frameworks. Andrej and Jacob were placed in long-term protective custody, shielded from further sect influence. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 8. On November 2, 1997 in San Marcos, California, police entered a suburban residence and discovered 4 deceased boys alongside their injured mother, 33-year-old Susan Eubanks. The boys had been shot at close range with a handgun. Susan had a non-fatal gunshot wound indicating a suicide attempt. No signs of forced entry or fleeing assailants were present, and the weapon was recovered inside the home. The combination of multiple child victims and a surviving parent immediately focused suspicion on Susan as the primary actor in the incident. The triggering event was initiated when a family member contacted law enforcement after a disturbing phone call in which Susan expressed suicidal intent and made cryptic references to ending things. Officers arrived for a welfare check, gaining entry when no one responded at the door. They found Susan on the floor with a gunshot wound to the abdomen. In separate bedrooms and hallways, they located 14-year-old Brandon, 7-year-old Austin, 6-year-old Brigham, and 4-year-old Matthew, all deceased. Emergency medical services confirmed that the boys had been shot execution style. Investigators secured the scene, recovered a .38 caliber revolver, and documented spent shell casings. Evidence indicated that several hours had passed between the killings and discovery. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. The victims were siblings ranging from preschool age to early adolescence. They lived with their mother in a home characterized by ongoing financial instability, substance abuse issues, and volatile romantic relationships. Statements from relatives and neighbors documented frequent arguments between Susan and her boyfriend, as well as previous conflicts with her ex-husband over custody and visitation. Alcohol consumption and prescription medication misuse were noted as routine stressors in the household. In the weeks preceding the murders, Susan experienced relationship breakdown, unemployment pressures, and deteriorating mental health. The children were present during these conflicts and dependent entirely on Susan for care and supervision. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Investigators performed toxicology testing on Susan, revealing elevated blood alcohol levels and the presence of prescription sedatives. Evidence suggested she consumed both substances prior to the shootings. Forensic analysis of blood patterns, shell casing placement, and positional evidence indicated deliberate movement from room to room as each child was shot. Suicide attempt indicators included the abdominal gunshot wound, lack of defensive struggle, and a note referencing betrayal and anger. Interviews with family, friends, and partners established a timeline of escalating domestic disputes on the night of the killings. Psychological assessment later identified themes of retaliatory intent toward romantic partners, consistent with filicide cases involving revenge motives. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. Susan was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including multiple victims. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation based on weapon retrieval, sequential shootings, and suicide attempt timing. Aggravating factors under California law made Susan eligible for the death penalty. The defense argued diminished capacity due to intoxication and emotional crisis, but the jury rejected the claim, citing the orderly progression of the shootings and the absence of external interference. The court found Susan guilty on all counts, and she was sentenced to death. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Following sentencing, Susan was transferred to the Central California Women's Facility and placed on death row. In later years, shifts in capital punishment policy and successful appeals regarding sentencing procedures led to her sentence being converted to life without the possibility of parole. Surviving family members expressed dissatisfaction with the commutation, asserting that the severity of the crimes warranted execution. Susan has continued to exhibit limited remorse, framing her actions in terms of personal suffering rather than accountability. Her case remains one of the most widely cited examples of maternal filicide involving multiple siblings. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 9, Dominique Cottrez, 8 neonaticide murders. In July 2010, in Villers-aux-Tertres, France, utility workers performing garden excavation uncovered human infant remains on a residential property linked to 45-year-old nurse's aide Dominique Cottrez. Initial assumptions of a historic burial were dismissed when forensic teams identified multiple remains, suggesting repeated neonaticide rather than a single incident. Within hours of police questioning, Dominique admitted to killing newborn children at home over a period spanning decades. The confession introduced a case of serial maternal neonaticide unprecedented in modern French criminal history. The triggering event began when a couple renovating their newly purchased home contacted authorities after gardeners uncovered skeletal remains wrapped in plastic. Police secured the property and expanded excavation to the garage, garden, and adjacent soil. Additional remains were located in bags and shallow graves, prompting the involvement of forensic anthropology teams. Early pathology confirmed the remains belonged to newborns. Investigators traced previous residency to Dominique, who was brought in for questioning. She disclosed that multiple births and killings had occurred in secrecy at the property over many years. Forensic teams cataloged remains, dating material, and burial positions to document the scale of the offenses. The transition from a single discovery to a serial homicide investigation occurred rapidly, but the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. The victims were 8 newborn infants delivered in secret by Dominique over a span of approximately 17 years. Dominique concealed each pregnancy from her husband, daughters, and medical personnel, avoiding prenatal care and wearing loose clothing to obscure physical changes. Births occurred at home without assistance in bathrooms or bedrooms, and infants were killed immediately after delivery. The home environment maintained strict secrecy, supported by Dominique's role as a caregiver and her control over household spaces. During interviews, she claimed motives rooted in trauma from childhood sexual abuse by her father, stating she feared becoming pregnant by him despite having a husband. Familial secrecy and psychological defenses created conditions in which repeated neonaticide went undetected. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Forensic teams worked to date remains using bone mineralization and container materials. Pathology ruled out congenital disorders and confirmed that the newborns had been viable at birth. Pattern analysis identified consistent suffocation and negligence markers. Investigators compared Dominique's confession with forensic chronology to confirm the sequence of births and deaths. Hospital records showed no obstetric history, supporting the claim that all pregnancies were concealed. Interviews with family confirmed ignorance of the pregnancies, while neighbors reported no visible signs of childbirth. Prosecutors corroborated Dominique's statements through independent forensic timelines and burial stratigraphy. Then, A single security camera revealed what had really happened. Police filed charges for multiple counts of homicide, classifying the incidents as neonaticide rather than fetal death or abandonment. Dominique underwent psychiatric evaluation to assess trauma, dissociation, and risk of reoffending. Experts described her as emotionally detached but competent and not psychotic at the time of the crimes. The defense argued that decades of sexual abuse and psychological repression influenced her behavior and impaired decision-making. The prosecution emphasized repetition, concealment, and opportunity to seek medical or contraceptive intervention. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. Dominique was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison, a penalty seen as lenient relative to the number of victims. Public and media reaction ranged from disbelief to outrage, with commentators questioning how 8 pregnancies could occur unnoticed and why no medical or social services system intervened. Legal experts debated the intersection of trauma, culpability, and neonaticide classifications in French law. Child welfare advocates criticized systemic gaps that allowed decades of concealed childbirth. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators. Case 10. On November 5, 2001, in Pennsylvania, 28-year-old Dr. Andrew Bagby was found dead in a state park with multiple gunshot wounds. Investigators determined that the murder weapon was a .22 caliber handgun, a model recently purchased by his ex-partner, 40-year-old Canadian physician Dr. Shirley Turner. Witness interviews established that Andrew had met Turner the night before his death. As police reconstructed timelines and communications, Turner emerged as the primary subject of the investigation, setting the stage for a cross-border legal case. The triggering sequence began when a passerby located Andrew's body inside Keystone State Park and contacted local authorities. Police identified the victim through personal documents and immediately classified the incident as a homicide due to ballistic evidence and close-range firing patterns. Forensic technicians recovered shell casings consistent with a handgun known to be owned by Turner. Phone records and airline data showed she had traveled from Iowa to Pennsylvania the night before the murder and returned shortly after. Investigators learned that Turner had recently purchased a firearm and undergone training. The combination of travel records, ballistic indicators, and interpersonal motive redirected the case from an unexplained homicide to a targeted killing. But the evidence at the scene did not match the initial story. Andrew and Shirley had been in a tumultuous relationship marked by jealousy, emotional volatility, and on-and-off reconciliation attempts. Andrew had attempted to end the relationship shortly before his death, expressing concern to friends about Turner's behavior. Turner later announced that she was pregnant with Andrew's child, introducing custody implications into the case. After the murder, Turner returned to Canada, where she gave birth to a son named Zachary in July 2002. The cross-border nature of the case, combined with custody disputes and extradition requests, created a complex legal landscape. It would take only days for their quiet life to unravel. Investigators in the United States filed extradition requests to bring Turner back to face homicide charges. Canadian courts granted her bail multiple times during the process, citing the absence of a criminal conviction and the need to consider Turner's parental rights. Psychological evaluations revealed a history of unstable relationships, threats of self-harm, and controlling behavior toward former partners. Witnesses documented stalking, harassment, and persistent interference in Andrew's life. Legal proceedings slowed as appeals, mental health assessments, and custody hearings accumulated. Then, a single security camera revealed what had really happened. The judicial turning point came through bail rulings and custody litigation surrounding Zachary. Despite warnings from Andrew's parents and law enforcement about Turner's instability, courts continued to release her on bail with limited conditions. Bagby's parents were granted supervised visitation rights with Zachary, but Turner retained primary custody. As extradition proceedings approached resolution and Turner faced the likelihood of being handed over to U.S. authorities, risk indicators escalated. When confronted with the evidence, the suspect gave a statement that shifted the entire case. On August 18, 2003, Turner drugged 13-month-old Zachary with Ativan, strapped him to her chest, and jumped from a pier in Conception Bay, Newfoundland. Both drowned. The murder-suicide drew international attention and prompted public scrutiny of Canada's bail and child protection systems. Andrew's close friend Kurt Kewen later documented the case in the film Dear Zachary, which highlighted judicial failures and the devastating impact on both families. Turner never stood trial for Andrew's murder, and no U.S. proceedings occurred posthumously. In 2005, Canada enacted Bill C-464, granting judges broader authority to deny bail to defendants considered a risk to children or the public. To this day, the motive remains a point of debate among investigators.